Hello there, it's me again. I thought I would try out this new thing called recent reads. Not new as in like I've seen it, other people do it, and I thought that might work for me. Because when it comes to like monthly wrap-ups, like I don't read that much in a month, and even if I do, then often I feel like the books don't necessarily go well together in a video. But recent reads is just like the last 10 books that you've read. So I thought that's like, yeah, I'll give it a try. Why not? I had back in April when I did the Greek myth retelling thing, a lot of books that began as like a 3-star or maybe 4-star read would suddenly like just become brilliant by the end, even in like the last few pages sometimes, which gave me a feeling that okay, I just have to rate these books 5 stars. And I've had the opposite of that lately, where it begins as like a 4 or 5 star, like I'm completely sucked in and I'm loving it, and then at some point, like halfway or 2/3, or in one case like in the last few pages, the book just like sabotages itself and does something which really makes me like unhappy when I finally close the covers. And so I ended up giving a kind of low rating to about half of these, I think. What for me felt like a low rating, just because I ended on a sort of a downer. But you know, I wouldn't say that it was overall a bad reading experience. Like I got a lot out of all of these books, and I even found a new favorite, so definitely no complaints here. So first of all, we have The Lightkeepers by Geni. This is about a nature photographer who goes to these islands that are somewhere off the coast of the USA. I don't know exactly where, I forget what they're called, a real place. And she's taken pictures of the desolate rocks and the seals and sharks and birds and mice. And yeah, there's lots of animal stuff and nature. And also there's some biologists like wildlife biologists. So you've got a lot of disparate people isolated on an island together, and it's a good setup for something to happen, right? The story is also like technically epistolary, although it doesn't really feel like it. But like early on, we figure out that the narrator, the nature photographer, is telling us this story in the form of letters written to her dead mother. So after her mother died, she was traumatized, but she decided to keep writing letters and just sort of like a diary, like letting her mum know what her life is like. And so that was also an interesting kind of format choice, although apart from having a few chapters begin in the second person, it basically reads like a normal first person novel. So the kind of mix of themes here was one of the things that kept me interested at the beginning. We've got maybe a potential mystery scenario, and there's all the nature writing, and she's also struggling with grief, and this past trauma in her life, and there's also a lot on photography. And so it was like, how are all these disparate threads going to come together? And to be honest, they didn't. Things that seem alluring at the beginning just get kind of monotonous and obvious in some cases. Like at the beginning, it's kind of suggested that the reason that she became a nature photographer was to sort of like escape from the world. And we also know that there's this trauma in her life because of her mother's death. And then later in the novel, she directly says to the mother, "Your death made me a nature photographer." And then it's like, oh, okay, right. It was nicer when it was something to intuit rather than just being bluntly told. Another cool thing was this idea of the main character using the camera as a way of distancing herself from nature. The camera was something that was like putting a wall between her and the world. And that's such a interesting idea about what it means to like make art and stuff like that, right? And to sort of, make replicas of life as it's happening around us. And that was an interesting idea, and then just got repeated and repeated and repeated ad nauseum without ever going anywhere. Like these cool ideas weren't being explored through characterization, through dialogue, through musings, through anything. They were just being repeated. So I want to say like what I learned about writing from this book, because I thought like for each one of these books I could do a little what I learned today. So what I learned was genre expectations can work against you, because I didn't know what this book wanted to be. The thing is, I usually like going into books blind, not knowing that much about what I'm going to get. But as this started, like having all these people isolated on an island, and there was a sort of like sinister vibe and a feeling like, oh, maybe this is going to be like a mystery, or like a murder's going to happen, or some sort of crime, or like what's going to happen here. And then it just went on and on without anything happening, and just lots of descriptions of nature, which I wasn't particularly into. And I started to think, is this a mystery novel, or is this like a nature novel and with just like some odd vibes, and for so much I didn't know what it was, and when it does turn out there's a mystery, I was just like, oh, okay, right, it's this kind of book. Like, it didn't inspire me with anything. Basically, I feel like if I'd known this was a sort of soft mystery novel which has a lot of nature writing in it and some thoughts about photography, then I would have been prepared and ready for what it was. But as it was, the things that suggested it was going to be one kind of genre then seemed to like not deliver on those promises, and that was a bit frustrating to read. Next I read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. This is the first book I've read by Kurt Vonnegut, and it's definitely not going to be the last one. The first chapter was such an interesting experience for me because I really liked a lot of the writing, and there were some really brilliant like images and turns of phrase and stuff that I just thought was like really playful and clever and genius. And at the same time, it's like it did a lot of things that I don't like. It was this metafictional, like the writer is telling you, I'm writing a book and I'm going to write a book, and that often doesn't work for me. But also the content of what he said he was going to write about was war. I didn't even know this was a war book when I picked it up, which might sound strange because like it's a classic and probably a lot of people know that it's a famous book about war, but I didn't know that. And so at the first chapter I've got metafiction and I've got war, and the writer himself is not like enthusiastic about it. Like, he says, this book isn't going to be so fun, like my other books are more fun. And when I was reading that, I was like, that's really honest of you. But it doesn't bode well for the rest of this novel. But I persevered, and I'm really glad I did because I really like this book. The writing style was like brilliantly playful. It jumps around in time, there's sci-fi elements in it, and there's just all, like, it does so much with flashbacks and flash forwards, goes off on these brilliant tangents. Like, there's this bit where the soldiers are being hunted. The American soldiers are in Germany and they're being hunted by German soldiers, and there's the dogs barking, and it's this sort of classic war scene. They're hiding in ditches, and then suddenly we get the perspective of one of the dogs, who is like originally from a farm, and she's a German Shepherd. Her name is Princess, and she's like, doesn't know what a war is, but she understands they're doing some sort of fun activity, and like she wants to do her best. And it's really like touching and funny and sad and nice and lots of great things, little like kind of surprises like that. And there were some really powerful moments in it. For me, the most powerful moments were when the actual times that it was written, it was 1968 or 1969 that this was published, I think. The times of the writing intrude a little bit into the narrative. Like, we hear about the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and when they come in, and you feel like the violence, the gun crime, the Vietnam War, and that just sort of like has this raw power, because that was what this book came into the world. When it came into the world, those were the things that were going on, and it's also an anti-war book. So I don't know, it just had this really interesting power to it. It's still not like a favorite book or anything, because it was still like metafictional in the way that I don't really like, and it's a war book, and I'm just not that into books about war. The thing that I learned from it was that a totally passive character can still be really fun to follow. Like, I've heard lots of people say that characters can't be passive when you write. They have to be active, even if it's a character who's like a coward and who always runs away and doesn't want to be in conflict and stuff. Those are still like active decisions which can drive the plot. Like, not wanting to do a task or something, or being submissive, still has like motivations and desires, and those motivations and desires can make the action move, right? Whereas the main character of this, Billy Pilgrim, is just like a non-entity. Like, he doesn't even like want to go home, you know what I mean? Like, he just things happen to him, and he goes from one shitty situation to the next, and it's still interesting to follow him because of the way that the writing is done, you know what I mean? Like, he's not an interesting character, but like his sort of absolute like pure passivity is interesting in and of itself, if that makes sense. There's actually a little postmodern bit near the end which I did really like, where the writer suddenly intrudes to say this book has no characters in it because nobody does anything, and I thought that was like, it could have come off as like kind of a bit too like smug and self-knowing, and oh yeah, I don't write characters or whatever, but when I read it, I just thought, yeah, that's right. That's amazing. This book doesn't really have characters in it. Like, it just it seemed wise to me, and he sort of makes it quite funny as well and relates it to the plot, because he says, there aren't any characters in this book except for kind of this one guy, and then he talks about this one guy in the book who is incidentally like a very minor character. But anyway, yeah, I really want to read more by Kurt Vonnegut now that I've read this. Next up is a thriller called Little Secrets by Jennifer Hillier. It's about a woman, Marin Machado, who loses her son, and the son is gone missing and the police can't find him, so she hires a private investigator, and still there's nothing. And then like around a year later, or a bit more than a year later, the private investigator actually discovers that her husband is having an affair now, because their relationship has really fallen apart since the disappearance of her son. And so now all of the grief that she feels at having lost her son is suddenly transformed into this murderous rage directed at this woman who she sees as having come into her life and intruded into her family, and like stealing another family member away from her. By the way, I know it sounds like I'm completely spoiling this book, but this is all in the blurb. And in fact, I saw 2 different blurbs for this book, and one blurb not only had this information, but it also gave away stuff that you don't find out till like the very end. So I'm obviously not going to talk about that. So yeah, a lot happens in this book at the beginning, and at first the grief parts were hard for me to get on with. I think I've been reading a lot about grief lately, and I think it's just something that does not work for me in fiction, or at least I've yet to read somebody who writes grief where I actually kind of feel engaged with it. Maybe it's like war. It's just something that's too big and horrible for me to wrap my brain around, really. And if I could wrap my brain around it, I wouldn't be happy and I wouldn't want to read the book anyways, if that makes sense. But anyway, so yeah, there's a bit about her, grieving at the beginning, having lost a kid. And then, of course, there's the other woman. And I found this idea of like the really self-destructive emotions of grief and of despair at having lost someone, and also like of, I guess, impotency. Like there's nothing she can do, even though, she's the mother and she feels guilty. And the idea of all these sort of like internal like feelings with nowhere to go, then being transformed into destructive feelings targeted at somebody else. I thought that was really fascinating. I thought that was a great idea, and once the book got into that, I was really enjoying it. What made it really great then, though, is that Marin Machado starts stalking her husband's lover, who's called Kenzie, and we get this first-person, anti-millennial, murderous rage kind of point of view. Which was just so fun to read for me. Like all the stereotypes of why the boomer generation does not like millennials were there, but like turned up to this ridiculous, murderous extreme. We get this inner monologue of this woman thinking like, why is this generation so obsessed with taking pictures of themselves all the time? Who cares what you ate for breakfast this morning, you whore? So yeah, I was absolutely loving this, and then it was like, whoa, it nosedived. It just went off the rails. The plot was stupid. The characters made really dumb decisions. The pacing was like all over the place. And like I guessed who done it. Like I figured out who the person was who was behind stuff pretty early on. And this was the same with the other one, the Lighthouse-Keepers. What was it? The Lightkeepers. I guessed it also really early on. I don't know if I'm just like Sherlock Holmes over here, pretty good at this kind of thing, or if I've just been reading really bad mystery thriller things, because I don't normally read this genre. But obviously, like, if the endings of these books depend on like shocking you and like giving you these revelations that like tie everything together, and you go, oh my god, that was that, and this person was that, and if you already know, then things feel flat when you get to the end of the book. And if there's nothing else to sort of like prop you up, then yeah, like if the real impact of the book depends on whether you know or don't know what happens like at the end, then it probably isn't a great book. What I learned from this, I guess I like generational conflict. I didn't think that was something I would have any interest in reading about, like the current generational conflict of our times. But yeah, it was really fun. I'd like to read more stuff like satirizing it. Next up, I read 3 children's books when I was just standing in the bookshop. I'm only going to talk about one here. I'm going to talk about We Found a Hat by Jon Klassen. I also read Brown Bear, What Do You See? And The Rock from the Sky, also by Jon Klassen. But yeah, the one that was really interesting for me was We Found a Hat, because it's the third in his kind of trilogy or series of books about hats. I talked about how the second of those is one of my all-time favorite books. I made a video of it. I'll link it somewhere around. So the books are about like there's an animal. The animal has some sort of encounter with either a hat or another animal, and it kind of like leads to a sort of a social dilemma or a moral dilemma, usually both social and moral, and but they're like in super easy language to understand. So in this book, there's these two turtles, or tortoises, depending on where you come from. But yeah, they find a hat, and they both want the hat, but there's only one hat, and there's two of them, so they decide, you know what, if both of us can't have it, then neither of us should have it, so let's just abandon the hat. And so it seems like a nice compromise. And they both agree, but one turtle, he's got the shifty eyes. He's got the Jon Klassen, like, little shifty eyes going on, and he's like, you know, there's the thing that Jon Klassen does of having the text and the pictures kind of have a disjoint. So the text will be like, yeah, we don't need that hat, we can just leave it over there. So obviously we know something's going to go down. The basic question of the book, which is, you know, can be read to young kids and enjoyed by adults alike, is when two people want one thing, is it better to just abandon that thing altogether? This is a question which I think has appeared a lot in like culture. There's like Solomon and the baby, and I just read a Japanese novel where it appears there's this Buddhist what's it called? A koan, like a little story called Nanzen and the Kitten, and it's always about like two groups of people want one thing which can't be shared, like a baby or a cat, and what's to do with what do you do? What do you do? This is like, I thought it was really interesting because although it's continuing the Hat trilogy, it's also kind of commenting on the Hat books that came before, because in the Hat books that came before, the Hat is the cause of a conflict, right? Whereas in this one, the decision to not have a conflict and to abandon the hat as a source of conflict is like the theme of the book. So it's kind of like, you know, like trying to move on beyond the questions or the stories of what he's done before. So it was really interesting in that way. Like if you read the two books before, you know that when an animal becomes very invested in a hat, something terrible is going to happen, basically. Something violent. And that kind of intertextuality is really built in, especially into the climax of this story, which I won't say, but it's like, if you're a fan of his work, I think it will be more surprising than if you're just a casual reader, because we're used to like kind of this very certain kind of denouement, which is different in this one. It's quite a hopeful book and like charming and clever, and that's the reason, I suppose, for me it's not as good as the other ones, which are more shocking and ambiguous in their endings. The other books just are really thought-provoking, but also like kind of, they've got this gleeful malice to them, which I think kids would just love, whereas this one is a little bit more like nice. And it's still really good, but also yeah, the colors, I didn't like the colors in this one. The first book, the backgrounds are all white, and the second one they're all black, and those sort of like, I don't know, they're just such strong colors, whereas this one, it's in the desert and the backgrounds are this sort of matte color and sort of brownish. Yeah, it didn't have that sort of visual intensity that was such a great thing about his other books. Also, just the drawings for the turtles, like the shifty eyes that I mentioned, which is like his signature thing, they're just not as suggestive of character and personality as they were in the first two books, I think. So yeah, it's still really good, but I mean, it just didn't quite match up to what had come before. What I learned from this one is that like individual private property is just at like the heart of a lot of moral dilemmas that we get in cultural stuff. Like, why don't we ever get like stories and dilemmas about communal ownership, you know? Like, I just feel like the concept of sharing is underused and undervalued as a potential plot device. Next up we have I'm Thinking of Ending Things, and boy, it's getting dark. I might have to take out the lamp in a minute. But yeah, I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Iain Reid. This is about a couple, and the girl, who's the narrator, is thinking of ending things, and she wants to break up, but she's agreed to go to see her boyfriend's parents. They've only been dating for like 2 months or something, but she's agreed to this trip, and they're in the car and they're driving out to the countryside. It's snowing all around them, and so, you know, even though she's basically decided, you know, to end the relationship, it doesn't make sense to say it now because that would kind of mess up this whole trip. So she's just gonna do the trip and then afterwards probably end the relationship. So there's this great tension, you know, with that plot device where the two characters are a couple, but obviously there's a huge wall between them because we're in the head of the one who knows that the relationship is going to end soon, and, you know, but doesn't have to end. Maybe it won't end. This first bit was like intriguing and a bit creepy, but it was bogged down by these sort of abstract musings which don't seem to go anywhere, I thought, on the part of the main character and her boyfriend while they chat in the car. And then when we actually get to the parents' house, the book just became really good. Like, the atmosphere was incredible. There was such a great attention to detail. Like, there was all these little little plot things and things that were said and little images that kind of lead you in one direction and make you think, wait, is that what's happening? Is this what's happening? And just it has your mind firing off trying to guess what the heck is going on with these weird people. And there's this housefly. My God, it's like the best housefly in fiction. It does so much for the plot. This little housefly that appears just for like one page. But there's all sorts of little details like that in the middle section of this book, which made me think it was absolutely brilliant. And then we got to the ending, and I'm not going to spoil it, but this ending for me was just terrible. Like, I thought, no, is this how we're ending things? Really? This is how we're ending things? Like, so much that I liked about the book was like subverted and trashed by the plot reveals at the end. And I don't know, I didn't guess what was going to happen. I started to, by the time, it's starting to happen, I started to think, wait a minute, it's not going to be that, is it? There's no way it could possibly be. So like, as I got to the end, I started to get more and more depressed as I kind of figured out what it was going to be. And then it was that thing. So yeah, I don't know, man. This book, I think I felt how people who watched Game of Thrones felt when the last season came out. Like, I've heard a lot of people felt not only that it was really bad, but that it was so bad that it made them feel stupid for having been invested in Game of Thrones to begin with. You know what I mean? So that's how I felt like with this book. Not only did I dislike the ending, but I felt that like it ruined the stuff that had come before, and that like, why had I put so much energy into it? Even though objectively I know the writing was really good before it, it got to that annoying bit at the end. So what I learned from this one was that a book can have great atmosphere, great like tension building things. You can use the horror genre like in really clever and brilliant ways, but it can all be ruined. It can all be ruined by plot, if that's how you're going to do your book. Like, he structured it in a really interesting and intricate and well thought out way, but the overall plot, man, it just, no. I always do my videos like right when the sun is starting to plummet. At least it feels that way. The sky looks really nice. But anyway, we've gone to gothic lighting for a while. Hope that's okay. Next book is Bruny. Bruny is a thriller. It's a political thriller. Bruny is a little island off the coast of Tasmania, which is a little island off the coast of Australia. It's got a kind of matryoshka thing going on there, and all three of those islands are very important for this story. The story is about a bridge which is being built between Tasmania and Bruny, a giant like fancy bridge project which is supposed to be like a huge investment for the state of Australia into its like smaller regions, and then it gets blown up by a terrorist attack. So the plot of the story is a character is brought in. Her name is Astrid Coleman. She is a UN conflict resolutionist. Is that what it's called? But yeah, her job is to sort of like speak to different groups, like the different local groups, and the people who are like opposing it, the people who are planning it, and just to kind of like settle tensions on Bruny. However, she has another secret agenda, which is to try and find out what the bombing of the bridge has to do with like how it fits into the global state of affairs. So from the very start of the book, it was pretty obvious to me that Astrid has a political and moral compass which is not the same as my own, but that wasn't a problem at all, because there's loads of books where that is the case, where you don't necessarily agree with or vibe with the main character, but they're still compelling to read, right? In this book, like, I was really intrigued. I was loving the plot and the way that it connected local stuff to global stuff, and to like it's our current political stuff, but it's like a little bit in the future, like a few years in the future. So there's some like predictions and stuff which are quite interesting. I was learning about Tasmania. Like, before I only had like the Looney Tunes Taz of Tasmania as a reference, and now I have like a kind of sense of the geography and of some of the beautiful nature and stuff like that, which is really well written. But the thing was that this thing happens in the book. An event happens which is not like a huge dramatic event, but it's an event where for me like a line is crossed, like a moral and political line is crossed, where I was like, oh, what? And it's completely consistent with Astrid's character. So it's not like it was badly written or anything like that, but it's just that her values are obviously also the values of the book itself, and so I suppose of the writer. I mean, I don't know the writer or what her intentions were, but like, oh yeah, I should have mentioned the writer. The writer's called Heather Rose, by the way. So yeah, I don't know her political opinions or anything like that, but a book has its own sort of moral compass as well as the characters sometimes, right? And when it comes to politics, it's very easy to alienate people, obviously. So yeah, I was just, once these events happened, I felt completely alienated, completely like detached from the characters and their struggles. I don't really want to go into it here because, you know, if you start getting into like politics and stuff, it can easily become a 20-minute, 30-minute rant. But I guess I will say that the thing I learned about this one was that sometimes the likability of your protagonist really matters, especially when it comes to things like values. Next, I read Carrie by Stephen King. This is a story of a 16-year-old girl, Carrie White, who is like really like bullied and unpopular and just like kind of the misfit kid in her school, and it begins with this incident of bullying where she has her first period in the shower room, which is, it's obviously really late because, like I said, she's already 16. But what's really surprising to everyone is that she doesn't know what a period is, and so when she sees the blood, she thinks, you know, she's dying or something. And all the girls are like screaming and throwing tampons at her and, you know, bullying her. And it's pretty horrible. This event also coincides with and may even be the trigger for a latent power that she has, because actually, as is said in like the very first few pages, Carrie White has the power of telekinesis. She can do stuff with her mind. This book was my first Stephen King novel, and it was brilliant. It was like iconic of its time in like good ways and bad ways. And also like felt really relevant in some parts to now. And those are like three things that feel they should be mutually exclusive. So the fact that I managed to feel all three of them in what's like a pretty short epistolary novel was impressive just by itself. It's got all these like second wave feministy kind of things in it because it was written in that time in the 70s, I think. It's the first book that Stephen King had published. It's a horror book, so it's pretty scary at bits. It dipped at the end, I will say that. It dipped quite a lot at the end. The climax happened pretty early on and was just drawn out for ages. So like everything was intense and it just couldn't maintain that intensity over that many pages, you know what I mean? Like if you stay sitting at the edge of your seat, you will eventually fall off, if that makes sense. Like you have to like shuffle back a bit so that you can go back. There has to be like a sort of rhythm that builds to intensities. It's very difficult to maintain like really intense feelings for a long amount of time, and so I think it really fell down at the end, unfortunately. What I learned from this one was that like telling stories with really minor characters in the book can be like the most compelling thing in that book. So there's like all these little characters who are just like so well drawn by Stephen King, they're given just enough life for them to feel like really alive, like they have their own little worlds and dilemmas and conflicts. But also the fact that he does that, and yet it all still feels connected by themes and by Carrie White, you know, who's at the center of it all. So for example, my favorite bit in the novel is the conflict between this lawyer and the principal of Carrie's school over the bullying incident. So one of the girls is being punished, and so her father, this hotshot lawyer, comes in, and he's like kind of like well known in the town, and he's, you know, he's rich, he's a lawyer, and he's like smooth talking, and he's going to sue the school, and they're all worried about it. And the principal, meanwhile, like we don't get much about him, but we get a few little details, and we know that he has this habit of like taking out paper clips and like unfolding them, like twisting them into straight lines on his desk. And it's just the kind of thing which, I don't know, you associate with somebody who's like maybe fussy or nervous, and the fact that he's doing it during the scene as well kind of you know, the scene is set up for us to see the principal fail against the lawyer, obviously, right? But then as it goes on, the tables start to turn, and we start to realize that there is more to the principal than meets the eye. Like he's ready for this encounter, and the lawyer, on the other hand, may not be as ready as he thought he was. And that little tension just in that scene could almost be a short story by itself because it's written so well. But the fact is that they are basically fighting over Carrie, right? Like the principal is on Carrie's side. He's saying your daughter was a bully, she needs to be punished because of the terrible things she said to Carrie. And the lawyer is saying like, these are just kids and you can't do this to my daughter and so on. And that Carrie white girl, she blah blah blah. But the fact is that neither of them really care about Carrie. Throughout the book we have these characters which are just like the principal in that they take Carrie's side and they kind of can rationally see how terrible things are for her, and so they're supportive of her, but usually it's for their own motivations. Like there's another character called Sue who feels really bad for Carrie, but it's really because she feels like, I don't want to be that kind of person. I don't want to be the kind of person who bullies someone and doesn't stand up for people who are bullied. So really it's like a selfish impulse. Like she's caring about her own character and her future and the development of her personality. She's not actually interested in what Carrie thinks or who Carrie is, And so throughout the book we've just got all these examples of potential for sympathy for someone who is a victim of bullying, and all these moments where you could have like characters develop sympathy or empathy or reach out or like really take the side of Carrie, and that never happens, and it feels incredibly realistic, because everyone's just in their own world and Carrie is just a figure who exists in their world but not someone that they actually want to get to know. So there's this really kind of tragic vibe to it, and I thought it was really good. I thought it was really well done. Next I read Comet in Moominland. I talked about it in my last video. Oh, by Tove Jansson. I talked about it in my last video, so I won't say much here. I think I didn't say how brilliant the characters are in this. They are so eccentric and strange and yet familiar. Like there's just like kind of really odd creatures that seem straight out of folklore or straight out of like a child's imagination, and yet at the same time there's just little things that they say and do which feels like really, I don't know, psychologically true. They're all like foolish. They're all like kind of like fools to some degree, but they're also all lovable. They're all like strange, but they're also relatable. So yeah, the characters are one of the things which make this just one of the best books that I've read all year, and one of the best books that I've read at all. What I learned from Comet in Moominland is that Tove Jansson is a queen. Then I read The Insect God by Edward Gorey, who also does the illustrations. The illustrations were disappointing in this one just because they were so small on the page. They were like in tiny, like if the page was this big, then the illustrations were like that big on the page, like little, like almost like stamp sized illustrations. And it was such a shame because his art is the main thing. Like the story is about a girl who gets abducted, another child abduction story in this list, but she gets abducted by these insects, and it's just the story is telling about like the fallout on her family and what eventually happens to her. And if you know Edward Gorey stories, it won't be great. And also, the title is The Insect God, so things aren't going to go well, are they? With a title like that. Anyway, the point is that it's a poem, but he's not a great poet, Edward Gorey. It's more like he writes in a sort of faux Victorian style, even though it was written in like, I don't know, the 60s or the 50s or whatever. And it's like kind of mocking the Victorian style, but also like, obviously he loves that style. Think like a cross between Tim Burton Gothic and like proper Victorian Gothic, and that's kind of where Edward Gorey is. Also, his illustrations are amazing. The story is, I think, more unsettling than his stories usually are. Like, usually his stories are a little bit eerie and strange, but not like really dark. This one was quite dark because, child abduction obviously is a real thing. But yeah, I liked it, but it just wasn't quite at that level of some of his other works, which I really love. So what I learned from this one is that illustration size matters. Like, I was surprised, honestly. Like, if the pictures had been bigger, I think I would have liked this so much more. Last but not least, I read The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. This one took me a while because it's not so big, but it's like dense. In terms of like what it writes about. So this is the story of a young temple acolyte who is obsessed from childhood with the Golden Pavilion in Kyoto in Japan. For him, it's just like a symbol of beauty, and the novel is basically like a psychological Bildungsroman. So it follows him through childhood to adulthood, like developing psychologically. Like if you're interested in psychoanalysis and sort of Freudian stuff, then this book is like a gold mine. Should have said it's written by Yukio Mishima, translated by Ivan Morris, and it's based on like a real life story of a temple acolyte who burned down the Golden Pavilion in, I think, 1950. So we know, like reading this, where it's all going to end. There's some really beautiful writing in this. There's some really like sensual descriptions which are just like perfect. There's this one of ikebana, like a flower arrangement, and as the guy is doing it, he's cutting the heads off the flowers and moving them, and like the description is of the shadows of the irises, the heads of the flowers being cast on the tatami floor, and like they're huge and like kind of misshapen, and it's just like got this great, like it's really well put, and it's such a great image, and it's so like resonant and sort of not suggestive of anything in particular, but really just atmospheric and great. It's just a great sentence. And there's some like philosophical tangents which were also like super interesting. But the best bits were moments when the philosophy and the sensuality and the humor, because there's actually some really funny stuff in this book as well, when they all come together for like certain scenes, it's really good, and it made me laugh out loud. Like there's this one bit where he's alone with a woman, and it seems like he's going to lose his virginity, and like he they're talking and there's all this tension, and finally he like just reaches his hand up her skirt, and then there's a little one-line paragraph which I usually hate, but the line is, "Then I saw the Golden Temple." And because like the Golden Temple is this abstract image of pure beauty, and because that appears for him, it destroys any feelings of like lust or even just being in the world. It's like a kind of like a annihilating force, so he's unable to feel like connected to life, he's connected to people, he's completely alienated because of this image of beauty, and so yeah, it's got some really interesting and funny and just great scenes in it like that, striking images, but there's also a lot of it where it doesn't all come together like that. So overall I feel like it's quite uneven. Like uneven is the word that I would use to describe this more than anything else, probably. I actually started to doubt how this was going to end, even though I knew how it was going to end, right? Because like I knew the historical fact that the temple gets burned down, but it goes on, and for so long without any plot really, just psychological development of this guy and his relationship towards the temple, and that even though it all seems to be pointing towards him burning it down, when we got to the when we start to get to the bit, I started to think he's just not going to do it, is he? Like it's been so long reading this book, and there's been so much, it's like he's no way, he's not going to burn it down, is he? Even though like I kind of objectively knew he would. So that was interesting, that feeling. And I had it also on the inverse with the Moomin book as well, which was interesting because I read them about the same time. Because with the Moomin book, I knew this is a kid's book, so the comet isn't going to hit the earth and kill everybody, right? Like it seems to. Like they keep saying, Moomin Mama will find a way. Like it'll be fine. We'll hide in a cave. We'll hold up our umbrellas. Everything will be fine. But as that comet got closer and closer, I really started to just doubt and think, oh my god, are they going to be okay? Like I got so worried. And in this one as well, the fact that at the ending I wasn't just like, come on, burn the thing down already. I was like, wait a minute, is he really going to do it? I don't think he is, like that says something to how the writing kind of like got in my head, and like, against reason made me believe in things that I shouldn't really have been believing in. So that's quite interesting, I think. Also, another thing that these two books had in common, which I noticed while I was reading them at the same time, is that they're both kind of about the end of the world, because this one, obviously the comet is going to destroy the world, and in this one he basically thinks that destroying the Golden Temple would be the same as destroying the world, and he goes into a lot of reasons for it, but it's basically, he sees it as an act of destruction, which isn't just vandalism, but which is like kind of ending one era of Japanese history and of his own sort of life history, and so that something else can begin. But it's got a very apocalyptic feeling to it at the end, which I really appreciated, as people should know from the name of this channel. So the thing I learned about this one, well, I learned loads of stuff from this book actually. It had so much interesting stuff in it, it just dragged on for too long. But I think, I need to read more philosophical fiction, because I would classify this as philosophical fiction, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in philosophy and Buddhism, and also like a good story, to give it a try, even though I may not have sold it so well in this video. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for staying with me as day became night, and yeah, please leave a like on the video, leave a comment down below if you have any thoughts, or if you just want to chat, because that's always nice too. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.